I lost an entire season of tomatoes to nothing. No drought, no disease, no pest pressure worth talking about. I had 90 plants across a quarter acre of my best ground, the bed I'd been building for 4 years. By August, they were thin, pale, setting fruit the size of golf balls when they set it all. I walked those rows every day for 3 months watching it happen, and I couldn't tell you why. That was year 5 on this land. I'd been farming long enough to think I knew what I was doing. Turns out I was just good at buying inputs. I've been working this property for 14 years. 3 acres, rotating vegetables, soft fruit, and a small flock of chickens and rabbits that we added in year 6 when I started to understand what I was missing. I've grown market tomatoes, dry beans, winter squash, garlic, and a dozen other crops at different scales and with different levels of success. I've also lost money, lost harvests, and hauled more bags of fertilizer from the co-op than I want to think about. I'm not a soil scientist. I'm a farmer who finally started listening to what the land was telling me, and learning to hear it took longer than it should have. That bad tomato year didn't make sense to me until fall, when I had a soil test run on the main vegetable ground. The numbers weren't dramatic. Phosphorus slightly low, organic matter sitting at 2.1%, pH in a reasonable range. Nothing that looked like a crisis on paper. But I had been working that bed for 5 years with the same approach: compost in spring, granule fertilizer at transplant, liquid feed every 6 weeks through the summer. Every season, the plants responded. Green up, set fruit, finish the season. What I couldn't see was what was happening underneath that response. The soil was flatlining. I was feeding the plant directly, from outside the system, every season. And when the conditions weren't right for that dissolved nitrogen to move, when it was hot and dry for 3 weeks in July, there was nothing stored, nothing held in reserve. The biology that should have been banking nutrients and cycling minerals wasn't doing much, because I hadn't been feeding it. I had been feeding around it. That is the loop, and I ran it for 7 years before I had a name for it. You apply fertility from outside the system. The crop takes what it needs. You harvest. The soil drops back to baseline. The next spring you start over a little more this time because last year's yields were disappointing, and the purchases creep up year over year because the soil isn't improving. It is being maintained at a floor with a constant inflow of material from a store. The advice you get inside this loop makes it worse. Test your soil, correct the pH, add calcium when the tomatoes get blossom and rot, add iron chelate when the leaves yellow between the veins. Every symptom has a product, and every product treats the symptom without touching the underlying problem. The system is structurally designed to need more inputs over time, not fewer. And as long as you stay inside that structure, you will keep needing more. I didn't understand this until I started looking for an explanation for why my soil test numbers hadn't moved in 4 years of what I thought was conscientious management. That search eventually led me to records of traditional Japanese farming practice: small plots, half an acre, in continuous production for hundreds of years without imported fertility. No fertilizer aisle. No co-op. No truck showing up in April with amendments. The same ground, producing food, for 4 centuries, without declining. That is not a romantic story. That is a design problem they solved that I hadn't. The question they were asking was different from the one I'd been asking. I was asking, what is the soil missing and which product replaces it? They were asking, how does fertility move through this system and what keeps it moving? That one reframe changes everything about how you design the garden, what you plant, what you keep, what you do with waste, and what relationship you're trying to hold between the soil and everything growing in it. There are 3 fertility sources in a functioning closed-loop system. None of them come from a store. All 3 were already available on my 3 acres. I just hadn't assembled the relationships. The first one cost me nothing and took 2 seasons to trust fully. I planted comfrey, the variety, Bocking 14, which doesn't seed around the property along the edges of my raised rows and at the borders of the main vegetable section. Every 3 to 4 weeks, I cut it to the ground and lay the material flat between the crop rows. That is the entire operation. No digging it in. No composting first. No processing. You cut it, you lay it down, and you walk away. What happens next took me a season to believe. Within 2 days, the leaves are wilted flat to the surface. Within 2 weeks, the material has broken down to a thin, dark layer, and the earthworm activity directly beneath it has increased in a way you can see with your own eyes when you lift the mulch. Comfrey puts roots down 2 feet or more, well below the topsoil horizon, and pulls potassium and other minerals up into its tissue. Every cut deposits that mineral content at the surface. You are mining subsoil fertility with a plant that regrows in 3 weeks without being replanted. I run borage alongside it as a secondary chop and drop. In year 2 of this system, my spring soil test came back with measurably higher potassium than my original baseline without having applied potassium directly in any form. That result changed my understanding of what this land was capable of doing on its own when I stopped getting in the way. The second source is the one that made the largest practical difference on this operation, and the one where I made my clearest early mistake. We added 3 does in stacked hutches in year 6, and I chose rabbits specifically because of what the manure does and doesn't require. Rabbits are hindgut fermenters. By the time the waste exits the animal, fermentation is complete. The pellets run around 2% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, 1% potassium. They are pathogen-free and weed seed-free right out of the tray. No curing. No 6-month composting cycle. No waiting. I pull the trays twice a week, scatter the pellets around the tomato transplants, the pepper beds, along the squash rows. The plants feed from it directly. 3 does cover a continuous rotation across 4 raised beds and the main row section without a gap in the fertility cycle. Chickens work differently, and that I learned the hard way. First season with the flock, I ran a barrow of fresh chicken manure onto a bed in early April, incorporated it, waited 2 weeks, planted brassica starts. Watched every one of them go pale and stall out within 10 days. Nitrogen toxicity. Fresh chicken manure runs 3.5 to 4% nitrogen, so concentrated it will burn root systems on contact if you apply it raw. I had to pull those starts, amend the bed down, and replant a month late. Lost the entire early season window on that section. What chicken manure needs is a pile. You layer it with carbon straw, dry leaves, spent crop stems from the end of the season at the right ratio, and the pile heats to 140 degrees within 48 hours. Kills pathogens, kills weed seeds, stabilizes the nitrogen. 6 to 8 weeks later, you have finished compost you can apply at high rates without risk. The sequence I run now, rabbit manure feeds the beds directly throughout the growing season, providing a steady, gentle fertility pulse. Chicken compost goes on in fall and again in early spring, building long-term structure and organic matter over time. 2 streams. 2 speeds. Between them, the beds receive continuous fertility without a single purchased input moving through the gate. The third source is the one you can't see, which is why it took me the longest to take seriously. The fungal networks and bacterial populations in healthy soil are the actual delivery mechanism for phosphorus, trace minerals, and water. A functioning mycorrhizal network extends a plant's effective root zone by a factor that soil scientists put it up to 100 times. When that network is intact, the plant has access to mineral resources across a far wider area than its physical roots could reach alone. When it isn't, the plant is on its own. I tilled for 9 years on this land because that's what I'd learned to do. Turn the soil in spring, warm it up, break up compaction, work the amendments in. The beds looked clean and ready. What I was also doing every April was severing the fungal networks that had spent the previous months slowly rebuilding after the last time I tilled. I was restarting from zero every single season and calling it good soil management. 3 years ago, I stopped. I apply compost and rabbit castings to the surface now. I let the earthworms incorporate it downward, which they do, visibly, over the course of a season. I keep the soil covered with a 2-inch mulch layer at all times. Nothing bare. Straw over the beds. Chop and drop between the rows. Bare soil loses biology to UV exposure, and temperature swings faster than most growers realize. A permanent mulch layer maintains moisture, keeps the surface biology fed, and suppresses most annual weeds without hoeing. The main vegetable ground looks different now than it did 9 years ago. Darker, more textured. It doesn't compact the same way after a heavy rain. My spring earthworm counts have gone up 3 seasons running. That improvement is not from purchasing anything. It is from stopping the practices that were destroying the infrastructure and letting the system build in their absence. I pull the rabbit trays, 2 minutes, Scatter pellets around whichever beds are in active production. Cut a row of comfrey at the border. 3 minutes. Lay it between the tomato plants. Check the mulch layer over the squash. 2 minutes. Every 3 days I turn the compost pile or add a carbon layer. 5 minutes. That is the full fertility management workload for a system, feeding this family from a 1/4 acre of intensive beds, plus another 1/2 acre in row crops. In year 1 of running this system, the soil held flat or improved slightly. Enough. In year 2, the spring test came back with higher organic matter than the baseline I'd measured 4 years earlier. Phosphorus and potassium both up, without direct application of either. Year 3, which is where I am now, the system is amplifying itself. More organic matter produces more biology. More biology produces more fertility. More fertility produces higher yields, which produces more material cycling back into the beds. The curve is bending upward. It keeps bending. My fertility budget for the past 2 seasons has been $0 on fertilizer and roughly $40 on straw for mulch material. That is the complete line item. A comparable operation running the conventional input model typically runs $200 to $400 annually on compost bags, granule fertilizers, liquid feeds, and soil amendments, and holds flat or declines while spending it. The savings here compound because the soil improves every season rather than requiring constant propping up. If you have no space for animals, run a worm bin. A bin under the kitchen counter processes food scraps into castings you apply directly to beds. No curing, no composting cycle, no smell when managed correctly. The castings test at higher biological activity than most bagged products on the market. I spent 7 years buying fertility from outside this land, while the land was trying to produce it. Every plant that grew here had already captured solar energy, pulled carbon from the air, and drawn minerals up from depth through its root system. Every time I bagged up the spent crops and set them at the road for collection, I was exporting all of that captured resource back out of the system. Then I drove to the co-op to buy back what I'd just given away. Stop buying fertility from a store when your garden is already producing it. Stop treating the harvest as the end of the cycle when it's the beginning of the next one. 3 sources. Running together. Running in the right sequence. Give it 3 seasons. The land will show you what it can do when you let it.